at that time, as a result of the Korean War, we transformed the North Atlantic Treaty into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, literally putting the O in NATO. So NATO, as you know, just celebrated its 75th anniversary last month on April 4th. And cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific has never been stronger. Shared strategic interests and concerns such as cyber defense, counterterrorism, counter-piracy, disarmament, and emerging technologies are all areas that have transnational effects across both regions and are issues that are ripe for further collaboration. But how far can NATO and Indo-Pacific cooperation actually go? And what developments might trigger deeper or diminished cooperation? These are all questions that we're hoping to address today. And we have three distinguished speakers to help guide us through that discussion. I'm happy to present them. Boram Kwan is as Associate Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. Her research expertise includes US security and defense strategy, US-ROC alliance, the nexus between US foreign policy and domestic politics, and economic sanctions. Dr. Kwan currently serves as the research coordinator at the Center for Security and Strategy at KAIDA. Ambassador Michael Reiterer is a distinguished professor at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governments, VUB. He has a long history of diplomatic service for Austria and the EU, including service as the EU ambassador to the Republic of Korea, where he and I met, and we've had a long relationship since then. He's an adjunct professor at University of Innsbruck, Webster, Vienna, and holds guest professorships at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Asia Pacific University Beppo, Kobe University, and Keio University, Tokyo. His research focuses on EU foreign and security policy, cybersecurity, economic security, diplomacy, East Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. And last but definitely not least, my colleague Yuki Tatsumi. She's a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program here at the Stimson Center, and of course, director of our Japan program as well. With an extensive history working on Japanese foreign policy and political affairs. In 2012, she was awarded the Letter of Appreciation from the Ministry of National Policy of Japan for her contribution in advancing mutual understanding between the United States and Japan. So we have a wide range of expertise here, and we are eager to learn more from them about where NATO and East Asia and the Indo-Pacific are going. And so with that, I am going to first call on Dr. Kwan. Oh, Boram, you're muted.
Hi again. Thanks for that great introduction. I was given 10 minutes to briefly talk about the paper that's pretty much online on 38 North. So I will talk about three things, basically, the drivers and opportunities for ROP-NATO cooperation, then the challenges and some limitations, and then implications for the Korean Peninsula, and then conclude with some final remarks. So let's start with the drivers for cooperation. I thought about four factors. So the first, South Korea and NATO understand that closer collaboration is needed to deal with shared security challenges in the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe. Policy coordination is most effective when there's an agreement on the seriousness and wide-ranging effect of North Korea's military provocations. So Europe condemned North Korea's WMD and ballistic program and called for the abandonment of its nuclear weapons development in the Vilnius Summit Communique of 2023. Also, collective efforts to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and provide security assistance are also in demand. The war is dragging on, and neither Russia or Ukraine can fight without external assistance. Unfortunately, North Korea is supplying Russia with arms, such as missiles and artillery shells, in exchange for food aid, energy, and military technology. Sustained military and technological cooperation between Russia and North Korea, whether it is low-tech or high-tech, poses real challenges to the security of Europe and the Korean Peninsula. The second driver is that South Korea and NATO can benefit diplomatically from increased issue linkages. South Korea, the development of the NATO IP4 can create issue-specific networks that expand collaboration and opportunities. South Korea was the first Asian country to join NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence and participated in the Lock Shields military exercise last year. And leading into interactions with NATO can also help, also actually signal South Korea's willingness to play a more proactive role in joining and mobilizing multilateral cooperation mechanisms. Of which some are meant to deter China's aggressive policies in the Indo-Pacific region. In addition to the revived ROK-US-Japan trilateral security partnership, this could provide a gateway for South Korea to join the likes of the G7. NATO members can benefit from the relationship in that they can ease their way into the Indo-Pacific region through issue-specific linkages with South Korea and its newly made Indo-Pacific strategy. This would help diversify trade and investment partners against pressures to de-risk from China, as well as create a resilient supply chain for critical goods. Now, of course, opportunities for joint military training and exercise will also increase. The third driver is that South Korea and NATO may benefit from deepened cooperation in the defense industry that would reinforce alliance capabilities and capacity. Now, South Korea's comparative advantage lies in the ability to produce high-quality, cost-effective weapons, such as munitions and mid-tier conventional arms, that are interoperable with NATO. The recent surge in RK defense exports to Poland were possible because of these strengths. But because South Korea's defense industrial base is basically focused on the domestic market, it needs smart collaboration with like-minded partners to sustain this level of performance. The fourth driver is that robust inter-alliance relations can function to deter or weather the impact of major external shocks. And shocks, I mean the upcoming US presidential elections. There is a lot of unease about US national security priorities and alliance policies going forward. And then it is unsettling that some US experts publicly weigh the strategic option of prioritizing the defense of Taiwan over the defense of Ukraine, almost pitting one region over another. I think this makes it desirable for Seoul and Brussels to engage in close consultation about reinforcing deterrence and role sharing in the respective contexts. The goal would be to project confidence about preserving regional security and the rules-based international order. Now, those were the good things. There are some challenges or some limitations ahead. I guess first, the scope of South Korea-NATO cooperation remains ill-defined. Clearly, NATO members are aware of economic and military challenges from China and the spillover effects of developments in the Pacific on European security. However, an agreement has not been reached on how far cooperation should go. Member states with strong economic ties with China have been reluctant to take a firm stance against its coercive behavior. South Korea, on the other hand, needs to distinguish between national security priorities focused on North Korea, as well as economic and regional interests that are wary of directly confronting China. Seoul's forging of close ties with NATO is likely to be perceived by China as an extension of US containment strategy and may jeopardize South Korea's relationship with both China and Russia. I think there's a certain degree of mutual skepticism about how much real assistance NATO can provide to South Korea and vice versa, which is something occurs. And in the end, promoting cooperation between South Korea and NATO in abstract terms that creates more shadow than substance may not be worth the potential limitation. Next, going on to implications for the Korean Peninsula, I've got about 5. As South Korea and NATO increase cooperation, they're likely to face some pushback from North Korea, China, and Russia individually and collectively, which could negatively impact relations on the Korean Peninsula. First, China has been opposed to the growing ties from the very beginning. It criticized the first IP4 attendance to the NATO summit in 2022, where a new strategic concept was adopted. Russia has claimed that the US created rumors about its military cooperation with North Korea to elicit military aid through Ukraine from South Korea, would otherwise be reluctant. It criticized the US for arming Ukraine in the short term and developing a defense industrial infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific for the long haul. Now, while China and Russia are currently strategically aligned against US efforts to fortify its European and Asian allies under its integrated deterrence strategy, they don't have an alliance based or shared values. Their alliance is not based on shared values or trust. This opportunity-based relationship could fray due to shifts in US policies. Next, North Korea stands to gain the most from such Chinese and Russian ire and denial. Pyongyang will legitimize its military cooperation with Russia using the South Korean-NATO relationship as another excuse to end and capitalize on its newly obtained military aid supplier status to the fullest in domestic and global propaganda. Increasing cooperation between South Korea and NATO may push China, Russia, and North Korea closer. Already, the upgrading of trilateral security cooperation among the ROK, US, and Japan has been cited as a reason for greater alignment in Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang. Although the three parties are far from creating a formal alliance, their growing cooperation can raise tensions in the region and hinder progress in diplomacy with North Korea. Increased joint military training between Russia and China in the East China Sea and continued joint veto of any North Korea-led resolution in the UN Security Council are also foreseeable. Most recently, Russia blocked the renewal of the UN panel of experts that monitor North Korea's sanctions compliance, while China abstained. So to conclude, let me emphasize that North Korea will reap as many benefits as possible from the alignment with Russia and China, while it pursues further advancement and institutionalization of its nuclear status. So Seoul must take deliberate steps to enhance issue-specific cooperation with NATO that has substance and is clear about its focus on North Korea. Since China and Russia can still influence Pyongyang in good ways, it is wise for Seoul to preserve working relations with them for whatever diplomatic opportunities arise. Further degradation of NATO-Russia relations could penetrate the Indo-Pacific just as much as China's woes in the Indo-Pacific could penetrate Eastern Europe, and this is something that nobody likes. Let me stop there.
Great, thanks, Boram. That's a great overview of South Korean perspective. I think next, let's go to Ambassador Ryder.
Thank you. Yeah, and, my pleasure to be here and looking at Japan and Korea and NATO, because having served in both countries, there was always a specific angle when it comes to North Korea and the challenges for security. When I was in Japan in 2002, Prime Minister Koizumi made his famous trip to Pyeongchang and brought back some of the abductees. Now there's talk about the Prime Minister Kishida trying to arrange a summit meeting with North Korea. So interesting to see within 22 years a sort of repetition. If I look at when I was in Korea, well, there was this summit with President Trump in all kinds of forms. So I have a strong impression from these two in relation to North Korea, but also to a larger degree on the security situation in Northeast Asia. So when I was wondering how does NATO come into all that? What is transatlantic and what is trans-Pacific? And I think this is probably where we should start to discuss a little bit. Why is NATO reaching out or showing interest? Well, if I make a footnote first, perhaps on the history, it's not new. The relationship with the different country goes back. I think that the longest standing relationship is with Japan, which goes back to the 1990s. Then was New Zealand. Then was Australia, I think, which is the most connected to NATO already. And in 2005, it was Korea. So the group started to form, the AP4 started to form, but came into the open in 2022. And I think that gave a stronger impetus. When it comes to Korea, I think it was possible because of the efforts to turn Korea into what they like to call a global pivotal state. Well, I always thought it's nice that Korea is opening up and not a single issue diplomacy anymore, reaching out also to other parts of the world, having now an Indo-Pacific strategy, having this efforts to work on values, which brings it closer also then to the European Union. And I think there is also the link to NATO. What we have seen is that there is only one security. There is no Asian security and the European security and the transatlantic security, and they don't touch each other. I think that's gone, and that's also something which the European Union has learned, and saying, well, we are part. Whatever is going on in Asia, we are concerned, and what's going on in Europe, and the proof is the situation which we see in Russia and Ukraine, which has direct implications for Northeast Asia. Korea, for example, changed in 2014. They did not join sanctions. In 2022, they joined sanctions. There's the discussion, what are the implications for a Taiwan contingency? And therefore, we see very clearly there is one security. So I think the interest, therefore, of security institutions and organizations is to see what is going on in other theaters. So transatlantic and transpacific can no longer be neatly separated, but they become one security. And I think, therefore, it's just normal that the organization, but also the players, are looking at each other. I think that the second issue is the common concern and common threat about proliferation. There is concern that North Korea is already proliferating. It's working closely with Russia, as we know, but probably also quite some links to China. We also were aware of the situation with Pakistan. So denuclearization of North Korea and working to avoid proliferation, I think this is an important issue, which is also one of the issues for NATO. The third element, I think, is deterrence. Deterrence plays double. We have, perhaps I could say, the US like the spider in the net, but NATO deterring towards East Europe, Russia, and perhaps then Korea, Japan, and US, the deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea and China. So I think this is also an important element, but it has to be done in a very fine diplomatic way, because there are risks involved, and these risks are very clear. If there is a Taiwan-China contingency, well, this will take will put a lot of strain on the US and its engagement in Europe. On the other way around, Russia and the Ukraine is keeping the US engaged in Europe and prevents a full engagement in the Indo-Pacific, which might be to the liking of China. So therefore, I think we need a very calibrated diplomatic approach, because on the other hand, we don't want to push one country into another camp. We don't want to push North Korea completely away so that we will not reach out to them. But I think there will also be interesting constellation, because China used to be the main supporter of North Korea, and this little love affair between North Korea and Russia right now, I think at the end of the day, if it were to lead to China losing influence on what it regards to be a buffer state, I think that would also create in the long term tensions between Russia and China. Because if we look back into history, despite this limitless friendship they have right now, there have been quite a lot of tensions and diverging interests between China and Russia, and they don't disappear from one day to the other. And I think therefore it's interesting if the four can play a larger role. Well, there, if you have a European talking about cooperation of four, then you always see a little bit the element of multilateralism. But I think it leads to the effect that if they organize themselves and coordinate themselves, they play a stronger role in their talks with NATO than individually. I think that's always an element. Their participation in NATO summits, now Washington will be the third time, is not only the participation in the summit, but as we know, multilateral meetings give a lot of possibility for informal bilateral talks, and I think this is a big added value for the four to be part of it. And then I think it's also important that NATO, if done well, executed well, can learn a lot from the AP4, because getting the unfiltered view, how they see the relationship with China, how they see the situation playing out in the Pacific Island states, how they see the situation in Northeast Asia, to get it directly from partners is much better than filtered through the United States, for example. So I think this is an occasion for NATO to get out of the Brussels bubble and get direct information from partners. I think which can prevent misconceptions and is what I always called open diplomacy in a mutual benefit. Last element, perhaps I think I would like to mention in that context is that for NATO, working especially with Korea and Japan, is also having access to technology. I think this is an area of cooperation which is important, and I think it brings also an element of cooperation, because neither Korea nor Japan would separate or decouple completely from China, but not to do it in the blue-eyed manner, but also not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as one has the impression the Americans are doing that with this all-out trade and technology war. So I think there we have also seen that NATO is reaching out. I think I can touch about challenges later on, but I think these are some of the areas where I would see there's a strong interest of NATO to reach out. But I just mentioned one challenge. What NATO will have to do is active public diplomacy, because I think the publics in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific hardly know what are the capabilities and the possibilities of NATO. So to demonstrate an added value and explain will be essential. Otherwise, I think there will be little to gain. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'll pose a question for you to think about while Yuki goes, and I do think there are some questions about what is the value of increasing cooperation with NATO specifically versus the EU or individual EU states, and I think it'd be good to kind of drill down into that in our Q&A. But first, let's go to Yuki.
Great. Thanks, Jenny, and thank you Happy to be here, and Japan program is happy to co-host this event. So this is awesome. And thank you for everyone for chiming in this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever the audience may be. Following after this two really well-organized structured presentation is incredibly hard. I think both of my co-panelists have touched upon most of the important points. So I think I would just bring in what the Japan thinks of its cooperation with NATO, where it sees its value. And then I think, Jenny, I think your first question that you just posed is like right on the mark. I get that question a lot from my, colleagues in Europe too. What's the difference between Japan versus NATO versus Japan and Europe? I mean, Japan and EU. So that's, I will continue. I will think about that as I also speak. So, I'll be eager to get into Q&A. So I'm going to try to limit my time definitely within 10 minutes, but possibly shorter. Japan really embarked on deepening its relationship with NATO back in 2007. That's when then and the late, unfortunately now late Prime Minister Abe visited Brussels as a first time for Japanese Prime Minister back in 2007. And at that point, you can already see the origins of how Japan sees its engagement and the value of its engagement with NATO. He talked about the shared value, first and foremost, democracy, respect for human right, rule of law. And I think that really is the baseline of how Japan approaches engagement and cooperation with NATO and to, with the EU and to a certain extent as well. And this is really important because fundamentally Japan considers Europe, regardless of the grouping, whether NATO or EU, as a critical partner for peacetime engagement and a reinforcer of those shared values and norms that Japan, Europe, and ROK shares. And those are the, some of them already touched upon. Human right, respect for human rights, rule of law, non-use of coercive measure to change the status quo, open trade, freedom of navigation, freedom of international airspace, and so forth. And that is really what the Japan looks at as it continues to deepen its cooperation with NATO. But it really ramped up its specific cooperation with the NATO countries when the Japan and NATO adopted the individually tailored partnership program back in 2003. They had the similar rendition of this document, IPCP, back in 2020. But compared to that document, this individually tailored partnership program, ITPP, is considerably bigger, larger, very, very much more specific, and go into different areas of specific areas of cooperation that Japan looks to deepen with NATO and vice versa. And there are four major categories in this. And first one is emerging security issues. Second one is more of a conventional security challenges for the global security. First and third is to look for specific areas of cooperation that Japan and NATO can really pursue. And last but not least is the promotion of the shared values and norms. But when I look at these specific areas of cooperation amongst these different broad categories, really a lot of that based upon the cooperation from the peacetime. So whether that's cyber defense, strategic communication, how to cooperate with emerging technologies, or maritime security, science and technology, also resiliency, public diplomacy, so on and so forth. That it's really kind of preparing Japan and NATO's partnership so that together, as we look at this Indo-Pacific region and Atlantic region more as the one big strategic space, basically, try to I guess buttress the framework of the international order that they both have supported since the end of the World War II, and since then they have benefited from. And it's I don't really think in a realistic sense, Japan thinks of Europe as a contingent partner in terms of, I don't think Japanese would expect a British warship sailing into Indo-Pacific region for South China Sea contingency or Taiwan contingency or, Korean Peninsula contingencies. But it definitely consider that it's important that, for example, Japan, British or French and Germany continue to sail through South China Sea area during a peacetime is very important gesture to enforce the shared value for freedom of navigation. Japan very much welcomes the observer participation from individual NATO countries to the joint exercise and training that it does have with the United States. And that's just not limited to NATO. It also includes some of the AP4 countries as well. And hopefully, with the continued improvement of Japan's ROK relations, hopefully we can get to the place where, we mutually dispatch observers to each other's exercises that involves the United States. And then I think those things are all, carefully considered through. And I think it will probably continue to progress with caution. My colleagues already mentioned about the what could be the challenge. And then I would say outside of area contingency from Indo-Pacific perspective, what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, that definitely has raised concern in Japan in terms of the pace at which Japan could expect United States to implement some of its defense cooperation items, mainly foreign military sales, and then also nowadays more and more as the conflict in the Middle East becomes kind of a sustained norm. Current Israel-Hamas conflict has been going on already beyond 6 months. We really don't have any end game to that yet. How does that affect our shared partner, which is United States, ability to continue to sustain its strategic focus in both of our regions? And I think that is really where our collaborations between the Indo-Pacific partners and the European partners really comes into play, where they really they can really be helpful to create safety net is a bad word, but then basically the system of the cooperation in the meantime to sustain and continue to reinforce the shared values that we all believe in. One thing to note, I think, on very much on the economic security space, and that covers a lot in terms of cooperation, advanced technologies, and the and cyber defense and so forth. I think Japan, and certainly I think South Korea, I think to a certain extent, watches what US is doing in terms of the measures that it's been taking to de-risk its economy from China, and to the extent how much they will push its own allies and partners to adopt similar approaches. Because I think for Japan, China is still the biggest trading partner. And I think South Korea, very much similar. And for Europe too, I think China remains an important trading partner as well. So if current US approaches of de-risking starts verging decoupling, I think it'll present a serious problem for all of our economies. So that is, I think, one thing to watch. And you might say that could be another opportunity for Indo-Pacific area and, trans-Pacific and transatlantic partnership to kind of converge with that, shared value or shared concern. But, I will stop at that. And then I think I'll turn it back my time to Jenny.
Thanks, Yuki. That's a lot to put on the table amongst all of our speakers today. And for our audience, please do, I know some questions are coming in, but if you do have questions, please do use the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to take a couple of questions or a few questions as we go along. But I wonder if we can go back to this issue again about what are the advantages or disadvantages of building greater cooperation with NATO specifically versus the EU or individual European states. And I wonder, Michael, I've given you time to think about this while Yuki was speaking. Maybe I can start with you, and then I'm sure Yuki has some thoughts to add.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's always this question, what can which institution basically do? What's the role of NATO? What's the role of the European Union? And then things become already complicated, because we have only 4 member countries of the European Union are not members of NATO, with the recent additions of Sweden and Finland. So there is already some convergence in membership. However, quite different, because I think one should not fall into the trap and think that NATO is turning in a catch-all platform. Whatever you want to do, you want to talk about economics, well, do it. You want to talk about trade, there's a trade, there's a platform, there's a security platform, there's a cyber platform, and then we talk about the hard stuff, standards for weapons. And I think this would be diluting the concept. And I think this is a challenge also for NATO to come up with an out of area program, because the Indo-Pacific, seen from the Trans-Pacific, despite what we have said, it is one security. I think one has to see that one is keeping things a little bit separated, because otherwise it's difficult to manage them. So if we talk about economic security, like, for example, the EU has come up now with a proposal for an economic security strategy. Probably the credibility of the European Union, talking about some standards when it comes to data protection and so on, is quite successful. Does not need duplication in another context. So forum shopping should be avoided, and I think there should be also clear structures, and each of the players has to define clearly what they can bring to the table without raising false expectations. So the NATO is a military alliance. The European Union is not a military alliance. A fundamental difference. Also, in practical terms, they might do similar things, but I think with another finalité, with a slightly different goal, and I think that should be kept straight. Like NATO will not turn into a security guarantor in the Indo-Pacific. However, there are a lot of touching points between the security in the 2 different theaters. But nevertheless, I think it would be very unwise to give the impression we can do that. That creates a credibility gap to be avoided for NATO, but also for the European Union, of course. Stick to what you can, and then you can convince people, and you can work with them, and you can get on board. And also be aware what are the consequences. I mean, I think some of you or the audience might have read the book Not 1 Inch. It took me some time to go through from Sartori, where she was explaining very well the cautious at the time playing with the Soviet Union and Russia. Well, I think there is an element to have in mind in China. Do we want to create the impression of encirclement? Is with an engagement of NATO, in addition to the Quad, in addition to AUKUS. So I think then again I come back to the finesse of diplomacy. You have to see how you work in order to be effective. And there are, of course, many gray areas, I would say. When Japan is cooperating with the UK and with Italy for a new generation of fighter jets, But is that a cooperation with NATO members? Is that a cooperation with European members? I cannot say it's a cooperation with EU members because the UK has left. But I think it is an area which is important and which I always called functional cooperation. And this functional cooperation is normally a door opener because you can isolate it a little bit from other areas, is part also of the concept when I think of China, where the standard is China can be a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. Functional cooperation opens the door. I can see which category it is, and I can do it. And I just would like to underline again what Yuki said. It's there. I would see with the AP4 the cooperative element amongst themselves, but also with the Europeans and with the US, and not ganging up against China as the main element. Again, one has to be careful in saying that, but being not blue-eyed, but realistic and figuring out what are my interests. And then you make an interest-based policy where, from a European perspective, you always have to have the values in the back of your mind. So another tightrope for diplomacy to walk.
Thanks, Michael. Yuki, did you want to add to that?
Well, his response was so comprehensive, and then I start looking at all the Q&A. So I think, if anything, just very quickly, I think I very much agree with that. What Ambassador said. It is a fine line act. That's why I think I emphasized at the onset of my remarks that the Japan really considers NATO as an important ally to enforce these shared values and norms from the peacetime. So it is important that to show the NATO's engagement and NATO's clear demonstration of interest in the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific is very, very important for Japan. And I think that is, Japan very much see it as the tension management, basically escalation management, so that whoever thinks about this coercive use of force example, it's not, if they could see that whatever their behavior they're thinking of could not only impact its relations with Japan or Japan and South Korea, major trading partner in Asia, but it could potentially impact its relationship with the partner countries in Europe. Hopefully that will be more of a soft deterrent effect. So I would just that'll be one thing that I would just reiterate.
Thanks, Yuki. A big piece of all of this, of course, and a big piece of NATO is the United States. And certainly President Trump, in campaigning for re-election, has talked about the potential limits of what the US will do in a contingency that involves NATO. Whether, if they don't pay, we're not coming is, I think, the term that he used. What does this kind of language mean for NATO and for confidence in NATO, and even in the trend to deepen cooperation with NATO? And how much do you believe the rhetoric that's coming from Trump? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I can jump in quickly because I had something on my mind which fits into this context. When we talk about NATO and America, we tend to forget Canada. And I think Canada is a very useful partner when it comes to value and to a different approach to politics. I think we should not forget it. I think Canada is unfortunately sometimes forgotten, but I think it's a big asset, an American asset within NATO. I mean, the transactional Trump is giving a headache to many planners. I think one of the advantages is that Europeans are pushed more to think how to become more resilient and more autonomous. Still a way to go, but it was certainly an eye opener, which was useful. But I mean, also Korea was suffering from the transactional approach of Trump in asking to pay more, basically, and I think also Japan would get another bill, which is a little bit sad to think in terms of the U.S. Army as a group of mercenaries who have to be paid in order to perform. And I think this is against the idea of the transatlantic cooperation, transatlantic solidarity, if you talk about these values. And if you think also historically, the intervention of the United States in two world wars, that was a different approach and not the approach, well, pay me first. On the other hand, Korea has an advantage here. Korea is spending 2.7% of GDP on defense, so better than many of the NATO countries. And with its arms sales, which is a sort of backfill for the Ukraine through Poland, has become an important player and can draw on an existing military complex, I think, which was known for quite some time to produce good quality for good price. And so I think this helps Korea to be more of this global pivotal state, and makes it a more active player.
Oran, please.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how former President Trump talks a lot about NATO and not that much about East Asian alliances. I think although he has started to speak a little bit about South Korea, I don't think South Korea is assured that he talks more about NATO and not us. I think we understand that we are in the same boat. I think personally, Trump is very unpredictable and he will do what he wants. But and I think in general, I think he thinks alliances are more of a burden than an asset. I think that won't change. But I just had a conversation with Professor Colin Dweck, who is a GOP or Republican Party expert. And he mentioned that although the party of Trump is the party of Trump, if you ask the right questions on what type of policy that the supporters would prefer on issues like the alliance, they're very pro-alliance people within the party still. So although it seems as though President Trump has a lot of power over his base, I think there is more probably flexibility on what he can do about what the alliances can do to sort of change his mind. Let's put it that way. And so I don't believe everything he says.
That's the problem with Trump. Like, you shouldn't believe everything, and at the same time, anything is possible. Yuki, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so possible Trump 2.0, Japan is already preparing for that. And Japan, because we basically have like a whole year to get ready for that eventuality, should that come to a reality. Just a few weeks ago, Japan dispatched number 2 of the ruling party and a former prime minister and foreign minister, Taro Aso, to New York, while Trump is waiting for his trial to start to have a chat. I mean, they had a media display, and although his why he had to go and the value of him visiting Trump now is kind of evaluation on it within Japan is kind of a split. But I was actually watching the little video clip that the Trump and also talked to the media before they go into the meeting. And I was very surprised that I don't know how much of that it was a script, but then how Trump really talked about he was my dearest friend. I really loved him. I miss him. And Mr. Aso, I know him well through my good, great friend Shinzo. So it's a great honor to see him here. So I think through late Prime Minister Abe's experience during the Trump administration, I think Japan picked up an important lesson on the playbook, that engaging him early before he really starts shaping his mind up about any of those policy issues is really important. So basically position itself in the place where be someone that Trump feels like he wants to talk to sound out ideas before he firms up his mind. I think that is that is an important lesson that Japan learned through what Prime Minister Abe was able to accomplish. Relatively speaking, I mean, he was the only world leader that he didn't trash during the first 4 years of Trump presidency over the Twitter, and that alone is an accomplishment. But I think Japan does, in terms of the officials level, Japan does have a great concern about what the unpredictability, Jenny, you mentioned, might I guess, present itself in its specific policy. And they're very much worried about the resurrection of the tariff heavy diplomacy, economic diplomacy, very kind of a transactional alliance relationship approaches to the alliance. They worry about all that, but at the same time, I think they kind of they're still in they are preparing themselves to position themselves in the more stable place in terms of its own relationship with the United States. But one other thing that Japan did during those 4 years of unpredictability was that Japan really kind of saw it as an opportunity to expand and deepen its partnership with other allies and partners who are suffering together. And then I think that could very well be the springboard to for Japan and NATO, to Japan, ROK, and NATO, or AP4 and NATO to start talking about it, because in the essence, we could all suffer together. So, shared suffering usually brings a great incentive to cooperate. So.
How true, how true.
Well, I think if I just can follow up on that, I think it's true, but we shouldn't do too much honor to former president and perhaps next president in concentrating too much on him. Let's see what the election is. But I think the cooperation with NATO for the AP4 is also a possibility to keep the US engaged within NATO. I think the drastic move to dissolve NATO, I think even there will be enough people around Trump to tell him this is not the smartest idea he ever had. So I think in engaging the US through NATO is a possibility, and I think there is a building stone. I think also the Camp David arrangement between or the invitation by Biden to Japan and Korea, and what followed from that, the Camp David principles, is an effort to bring the three countries together, also irrespective of the leaders. And I think that's important in Northeast Asia, and especially between Japan and Korea, to find a formula that it doesn't change with every change of government, whether the government changes in Korea or in Japan. But there's also the European speaking who thinks that formalization helps. So the AP4 is not an institution, and there is no Asian or Indo-Pacific NATO in the making. But a formalization of contact helps, and I think this is an important element here.
Thanks, Michael. I have one more question, and then we'll move to the audience questions, and that actually sets it up quite well. Even the increased trilateral cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. A lot of this is, contingent on South Korea and President Yoon making, moving from sort of this strategic ambiguity that it's historically held between the U.S. and China, and being much more having greater strategic clarity on China, which then leads to and opens the door to greater cooperation with NATO. And we've seen President Yoon be much more forward-leaning in the relationship with Japan as well. So that brings the question of, is the direction we're going sustainable? Not only based on US elections, but sustainable based on, how much is tied to the specific leaders now in East Asia being willing to make what seems to be pretty unpopular decisions domestically. And will that actually be sustainable regardless of whatever kinds of formalization or institutionalization efforts are going on right now? And Boram, maybe we can throw that to you first.
Great. Actually, Jenny and I were in New York a couple of days ago talking about how domestic politics matters for all democracies and their foreign policies. South Korea recently had National Assembly elections, and the ruling party didn't do so well. So the question I got was, well, what's going to happen to South Korea's foreign policy? Well, the president made a statement saying there might have been some communication issues, but I'm going to stick to my principles, and we're going to go with my foreign policy initiatives, and I think that's great. But it's a reality that the opposition party, the Democratic Party, and its allies have a very different view of South Korea's role in the world. And the alliance, South Korea's relationship with Japan, China, even NATO, it just has a very different worldview. So I think although the president commands foreign policy in South Korea, and the opposition party didn't get a supermajority, so it can't do serious damage to what the president wants to do with his foreign policy, I think it still can push back and create some obstacles. So in terms of implementing his foreign policies in the rest of in the next 3 years or so, there might be some hiccups. And in the end, in the next presidential elections, if we do see a change in the governing party, South Korea's democracy is so vibrant and so different on certain issues, especially on North Korea policy, that a big shift might happen. I think that's a reality that we have to deal with.
Yuki, do you want to add to that about Kishida as well?
Not so much on Japan, because Kishida, as low as his approval rating is, there's a question how soon he will go, or how, what his whether his foreign policy, Japan's foreign policy outlook will change that big in terms of its core principle of his foreign policy. Because I see it as, oftentimes in this country we talked about President Biden's foreign policy as Obama 3.0. I think ever since Abe left the office in 2020, I think we're looking at Abe foreign policy 2.0 under Suga, and then 3.0 on almost like 2.5 or 3.0 under Kishida. And I think there is now a much broader consensus on how Japan's view toward China, importance of partnership with Korea, not just vis-a-vis North Korea, but then also more broadly with China, that I don't think there's a huge difference coming in, even if we have a different prime minister. I think one lingering concern that they still is persistent in Japan is what President Yoon's successor's foreign policy outlook would look like, and how, more specifically, how his or her approach to Japan might shift, and if so, how much. And then I think Boram is probably a better expert than I on this one, but I think there's definitely a concern on that in Japan. But from the Japanese perspective, I think not a huge foreign policy shift, approach shift, regardless of leaders that we get.
Yeah, South Korea is the wild card here. So let's take some questions from the audience. The first question, Yuki, is to you, I think. So NATO attempted to open a liaison office in Japan in early 2023. France disapproved, rendering the initiative unsuccessful. So what are the threshold conditions for NATO to try again and exert meaningful influence in the Asia-Pacific, whether as an anticipatory or reactive measure, maybe to both Yuki and Michael. But Yuki, you first.
Yep. So on that one, I think it would kind of be in the ball's kind of on the NATO's court in terms of when they want to try, give it another go again. Japan had already sent its defense officials to their center of excellence in the NATO headquarters. So, it would have been a great, great demonstration of NATO's willingness or interest in staying engaged from the peacetime, right? They're not only going to be there for when the tension rises, but then they're there from peacetime, coordinating with not just with Japan, but let's not forget, I would say the similar thing for Korea, but then they will have a closer place to coordinate out of Tokyo, not just with Tokyo, but then just with but also with Seoul. And there's a U.S. Forces Japan headquarters in Tokyo. There's U.S. Forces Korea headquarters in Seoul. So that would have made those transatlantic, Indo-Pacific, coordination potentially better, or at least facilitated some of those day-to-day communication. So I think it was unfortunate that France objected. So I think I just turned to my European colleague to see how that conversation is going within NATO. I think Japan won't have specific objections and giving another go, since their folks is already in Brussels. So it is the matter of what are the understanding more about what was the background behind French objection and how that can be addressed. Is that very much what Japan needs to address, or is that more a collective decision on NATO's side, so forth?
Yeah, Michael, if you want to.
Well, I admit I have not met President Macron in the last few months, so to know exactly what his thinking is. However, I would interpret it as a little bit of expectation management and also reluctance to put China in a difficult position. I think one has to see it also in the context of the visits at the time, Macron and Xi Jinping. I think they feared to contribute to this feeling of encirclement to China if there is a NATO liaison office. Another question could be, what would that have done to the bilateral relationship between Japan and Korea? Would Korea say why in Japan? And if it were in Seoul, would Japan say why in Seoul? So if that plays a role, I don't know, but perhaps. But I think it was more an issue of not putting an additional strain on the already difficult relationship with China. And President Macron was going to China. Xi Jinping was recently in Paris. So there is a sort of effort to have a sort of special relationship within the European Union. So I would put it in this category. And if it comes to the substance, you can have consultations, you can have exchange of views, you can have port calls, you can have all kinds of activities without a liaison office. So not having a liaison office doesn't mean there is no contacts anymore or very difficult. It is, of course, a symbol, a sign, yes, but in substance, you can do the same work without the liaison office. One has to be very clear about that one.
Definitely. So there are a number of questions here about AP4, NATO and AP4. And so the first is Ambassador Reiterer suggested AP4 might be able to engage more strongly with NATO if they organize together. What about organizing with a subset of European nations as well? A small set of European nations have started to engage directly in Pacific security with increasing intimacy in recent years, most notably France, UK, Germany, and some others. Would there be value in establishing something like an Indo-Pacific security working group or dialogue comprising of a subset of most interested European nations and the AP4 together?
Well, I think we have it already but in a larger context. Based on the Indo-Pacific strategy, the European Union has started an Indo-Pacific ministerial conference. The first one has taken place a few days before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, organized by France, by the way. The second meeting has taken place in Sweden, and the third has taken place in Brussels. So all the foreign ministers of the Indo-Pacific are invited, and I think this is the open approach. In order to have this platform for exchanges, so it's larger than the AP4, but I think it's a clear sign of the Europeans. We want to reach out to the countries, and we do that on an annual basis on the level of foreign ministers. Interesting footnote: Sweden, as the organizer, invited at the time the United States. France, surprise, did not invite the United States. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency, perhaps, but from the European side, it's clear we want to reach out. I think a sort of coordination within the AP4 is taking place between Australia and New Zealand as a subgroup, and between Japan and Korea as a subgroup, because they have slightly different approaches, for example, towards China. So Japan and Korea would be more cautious, and the approach of Australia and New Zealand used to be a little bit more forthcoming. Also recently, with the change of government, this has also changed. I am personally in favor of the larger approach, because that's more inclusive and also reflects this comprehensive understanding of security.
Yuki or Boram, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just very quickly, I very much agree with Ambassador. I think given the nature of the partnership and the focus of the partnership that we're looking at, I think larger grouping suits probably better to that purpose. And another thing is, how many of those multilateral can we have? And at some point, they're going to start, working against a cross purpose, with each other, if not just adding another layer of all these different multilaterals. So just from that perspective as well, I think a larger grouping is better.
Well, that actually leads to the next question on AP4. And this is probably more for Yuki and Boram of, does the AP4 structure have any impact on the effectiveness of cooperation? Should AP4 strive to become institutionalized and act as its own kind of mini-lateral Indo-Pacific security multilat, such as similar to AUKUS or the Quad, and cooperate with NATO as a result? Or would it be better to maintain AP4 specifically as a loose group of countries that work with NATO?
I would say, I'll start, and then Boram can come in and add. My sense is AP4 will serve its purpose better if it just remains as a loose group of countries. In the Indo-Pacific region, we have enough of multilaterals and unilaterals going on already. And then there is, Shangri-La Dialogue, everybody gets together. There's ASEAN Plus, creating, I guess if this were my question would be that if we were to institutionalize AP4, what will be the purpose? Because the only thing that these four countries have in common is that, they have US as a partner, as a treaty ally. And sure, they do share, values and, similar things that both Japan and ROK shares with NATO. But beyond that, Japan and Australia is like a little bit unique case because their relationship have been pretty highly institutionalized. But I think I'm not quite sure how much of a value added does institutionalized AP4 represent in the plethora of multilaterals, that are flourishing in Indo-Pacific right now. But, Boram may have different views.
I actually agree that AP4 is better off being a loose institution rather than a really strict fixed one. Going back to the ambassador's point that NATO AP4 is a good way of keeping the US engaged in NATO, I think that is a really good function that is durable and could actually project confidence and could sustain regardless of the US elections or whoever's election. I think that's a really good point. What do you think, though?
I guess that naturally leads to a question also of, is there ever a future for a Northeast Asia Treaty Organization, a NATO, as you can call it? And if why or why not? And of course, this is what China always worries about, is that there'll be an Asian style NATO. And is that even a thinkable outcome? Yuki, maybe we start with you.
Again, I think Northeast Asia, or nowadays more broadly Indo-Pacific, remains benefit more from the basically have the track to take the lead in terms of the dialogue amongst the interested partners, and at official levels, it will be more of a not the formalized grouping. And the main reason I do believe that where does China fits into this, where does Taiwan fits into this, and it just very complicated map to navigate if we're just looking at Northeast Asia, where I think track 2 dialogue can remain more flexible and keep that dialogue open. So that's probably where I would stop.
Boram, do you want to?
I guess I would add that I'm for South Korea's position in its Indo-Pacific strategy that it wants inclusiveness. So I think I don't think an Asian-style NATO is on the horizon, and I don't think we benefit much of it. I think it will create unnecessary tensions with China. It's already too complicated in the Indo-Pacific anyway. And I think our best bet is to really dig into the lattice work of alliances and partnerships that's really growing under the Biden administration. And hopefully that would be able to weather off any other external shock that may come about next year or the years after.
Well, I think I I would just add here, we should have a little bit in the background that we do have the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF. We don't have the East Asia Summit, plus the foreign ministers meeting. Not the most effective institutions and meetings we have seen, but they provide, especially ARF, an annual forum. But I think with all the discussions about engagement of or role played by NATO and so on, as well as the Camp David arrangement, is also a sort of catalyst for China to engage more. I would like to remind of the trilateral secretariat which we have in Seoul. China is now willing to restart the trilateral summits between China, Korea, and Japan. They were, I think, the last one was 2019, and now preparations are underway for a summit pretty soon. And I think China would not have moved if they had not the feeling they cannot leave the initiative to the others. So I think this is perhaps more a reaction to the Camp David arrangements than to NATO, but I think it also plays a certain role.
Great. Changing subjects a little, there's a question that talks about interoperability, even with NATO nations, has been a challenge in responding to Ukraine, leading to the rise of the term interchangeability as a goal. So as South Korea increases its role as a provider to Europe, have there been any steps to enhance interchangeability? Are there any important limits to that cooperation? And I think, Boram, you touched a little bit on this in your paper as well. And certainly, Yuki, if you have thoughts about Japan at the same time.
I didn't mention interchangeability. I'm not so familiar with the term, but if NATO is having problems with it, I'm sure South Korea is considering it. I'm just not so immersed in it right at the right moment. But in terms of the limitations in South Korea providing arms to Europe, I think although there has been a lot of opportunities, like I mentioned, South Korea's defense industrial base is very domestic market focused. So in order to produce and export, it needs to produce a lot, and it needs to increase its production lines, make sure that there are enough orders. And this isn't happening in like a competition vacuum. There's a lot of competition, and I think too much attention has been given to South Korean defense sales too early on, perhaps. So I think it's been checked out even more than necessary in terms. I think in the years ahead, we have a lot to work for. And I think the defense firms in South Korea know this very well. Let's put it that way.
Great. Yuki?
No, I think we're good. Only to say that the interoperability probably will be a challenge for Japan, and especially, but that it'll be interesting to see how this current ongoing joint development program with the UK and Italy might change that aspect a little bit for the better.
Well, let me just fill in that one of the not so glamorous parts of diplomacy, but an extremely important one, is to work on standards, and this is in the industrial field and in the military field. And if you want to have this cooperation and this backfill operation, which we have seen with Korea, Poland, and Poland, Ukraine, you need compatibility. You need interoperation. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I think there we have to go back what we discussed at the very beginning, that the AP4 is not a cooperation which has started yesterday, but it has a long tradition. Korea participated in Afghanistan, and there are also agreements to work on these emerging technologies, and you cannot do it without having in mind the application, and this goes through norms and standards, and that's the bolts and nuts of diplomacy, and not the glass of champagne.
Although champagne is more fun. So one question one question comes as starting, we cannot negotiate with people who say what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. So what is NATO's stance towards China's expansion in the Indo-Pacific? Is it determined to support AUKUS, Quad, and other institutions? Michael, I think we come to you for that.
Well, I think this is, if it's the way the question is phrased, is based on a sort of misunderstanding that NATO will engage in the Indo-Pacific as a major player. I think this is not the case. NATO mentioned China, I think, the first time in an official document in 2019, and ever since, this one security concept, which we have discussed at the beginning, has grown. But there is a big difference between studying and interchanging opinion, what is going on, to have a good evaluation and understanding, then going to the next step, I intervene on behalf of. So I think you would, in the case of Taiwan contingency, you will not see NATO jumping in. And therefore, I said in an earlier intervention, it is so important to develop a credible out-of-area agenda. What can you expect from NATO, and what can and that should match what NATO actually can do. Otherwise, one would get into thinking like that. They will jump in and send, I don't know which fleet or which tanks. This is not what we are talking about.
Let me jump in here a little bit. AUKUS or not even Quad is really talking about any specific scenarios in East Asia and then anything kinetic going on. I think maybe the intention of this person who asked this question is more in the realm of what is how would NATO remain, how would NATO and allies in the Indo-Pacific, like Quad, perhaps Japan, ROK, different unilateral, might partner with them from, I come to this, my main point, peacetime messaging and peacetime cooperation. And in that, NATO still does play an important role in this region. I don't think in all reality, I don't think even for countries like Japan and ROK expects NATO to send stuff when a contingency happens in this area. But I think what it is how do how can everybody kind of partner and work together in peacetime to keep sending the message and reinforcing the message to someone who says, very well put, what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. And this sometimes, in South China Sea, in Taiwan's case, what's mine is mine, what's yours is also mine. So, but I really don't think that we're talking about, how many ships and tanks and counting numbers here.
Well, great. With that, I want to thank you all for this discussion today. I think it's been very enlightening. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation to grow between NATO and East Asia within certain parameters. And I think that trend is likely to continue given the geopolitical trends that we're seeing in the world today. I want to thank our audience for joining us and thank all of our speakers for their great insights. And we do hope to see you at future events. So thanks, everyone.